It was a dark and stormy night, and the delivery person, Sarah, was trying to find the address of the house she was supposed to deliver to. The rain was coming down so hard that it was almost impossible to see anything beyond the windshield of her car. She had been driving for what felt like hours and was tired, but she knew she had to make this delivery. Eventually, Sarah spotted the rundown house she was looking for. It was an old, dilapidated house with broken windows and overgrown weeds in the yard. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if it was safe to go inside. But she needed to deliver the package, so she mustered up the courage to get out of her car and make her way to the front door. As she approached the door, she heard strange noises coming from inside the house. It sounded like someone was shuffling around in there, but she couldn't see anyone through the dirty windows. Sarah knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She called out, "Delivery!" But still, no one answered. Just as she was about to leave, an old neighbor appeared out of nowhere. "Don't go in there, dear," the neighbor warned. "That house has been abandoned for years. It's not safe." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She thanked the neighbor and quickly got back into her car, feeling relieved to have escaped the creepy old house. But as she drove away, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. She glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a figure standing in the window of the abandoned house. The figure was holding what looked like a small animal in its hands, and Sarah could see it moving in a way that made her stomach turn. She couldn't tell what it was doing, but it was clear that whatever it was not natural. She sped away from the house, trying to put as much distance between herself and the abandoned house as possible. But the memory of that figure in the window stayed with her, haunting her thoughts long into the night. From that moment on, Sarah knew she would never take a late-night delivery to a creepy, rundown house again.
I'm a 30-year-old female. One day, I went to a shopping mall with my best friend. As we walked through the bustling shopping mall, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. Every time I turned around, I caught a glimpse of a tall man in a large coat, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. My friend seemed oblivious to my unease, lost in a sea of designer handbags and sparkling jewelry. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. As we passed by a store window, I saw the tall man in the coat reflected in the glass. And that's when I noticed something strange underneath his coat. He was wearing the same outfit I had worn just yesterday. My heart pounding in my chest, I turned to my friend and whispered, "Do you see that guy in the coat? He's wearing the same cloth I wore yesterday." We both felt uneasy and decided to leave the shopping mall immediately. As I got in our car, I finally allowed myself to breathe a sigh of relief. We did not stay long, though. We drove home as quickly as possible. The memory of the man in a large coat lingered in my mind all the times. It is a constant reminder that danger could be lurking around every corner.
I am a bus driver and take the same route every day. One day, I stopped at a bus stop to let a guy on, but he declined. An hour later, when I returned to the same bus stop, he was still there, but he had changed his outfit. He had been wearing a suit and tie earlier, but now he was wearing ripped jeans and a hoodie. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The third time I arrived at the same bus stop, he was still there, but now he was wearing a black skull t-shirt and khaki pants. The same thing happened the fourth and fifth times. Every time, he wore something different. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore and decided to confront the man. The sixth time, I pulled over to the side of the road and got out of the bus, calling out to him. As I approached him, he turned to face me, and I saw that his face was twisted into a grotesque grin. He lunged towards me, and I stumbled back, falling into a nearby ditch. When I looked up, the man was gone. Eventually, some of the passengers helped me out of the ditch. Other passengers tried to catch the guy, but he ran away too fast. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. I have never seen him again, but I will never forget that weird encounter.
I remember the day when I encountered a beggar in the parking lot of a shopping mall. As I was walking to my car, he approached me and asked for some money. I had a mindset that the beggar should find a job rather than begging for money, so I refused at first. However, I began to feel a little scared since there was no one else around, and the beggar had a cup of coffee in his hand, which smelled pretty bad. I eventually relented and gave him $5, but he was not satisfied. He asked for $10 instead, which annoyed me. But, sensing that the beggar could be dangerous, I reluctantly gave him the extra $5. As I handed him the money, I noticed that his hand holding the coffee cup was shaking slightly. I quickly got into my car and drove away, feeling uneasy about the encounter. 2 days later, I heard some disturbing news. Another woman had been approached by the same beggar in the shopping mall parking lot. When she declined to give him any money, he had become angry and threw his coffee cup at her. The cup contained urine, which splattered all over the woman's clothes. I was horrified when I heard about this incident. I immediately realized that the beggar I had encountered just 2 days ago could have easily done the same thing to me.
The red-eye flight was quiet, and every passenger on board had fallen asleep. The only sound was the steady hum of the engines as the plane cut through the night sky. But then, something strange started to happen. One of the passengers, a man in a suit, began to fidget in his sleep. He tossed and turned, muttering to himself under his breath. His behavior was so strange that the passenger next to him started to feel uneasy. Just as a flight attendant was about to wake him up and ask if he was okay, the man suddenly sat upright. He looked around the cabin with a wild look in his eyes, and then he began to move with a quiet purpose. He carefully unbuckled his seatbelt and crept down the aisle, stepping lightly so as not to wake anyone up. He moved like a shadow, slipping past the other passengers with ease. But then he stopped. In the front of the plane, there was a woman who was pretending to be asleep. The man crouched down next to her, and his hand went to his pocket. The woman's heart pounded in her chest as she realized what was happening. The man was going to try and steal something from her. But then, something even stranger happened. The man didn't reach for the woman's purse or her jewelry. Instead, he gently brushed a lock of hair away from her face and then crept back to his seat. The rest of the flight was uneventful, and when they landed, the passengers filed off the plane without incident. But the woman who had been pretending to sleep couldn't shake the feeling that something strange had happened. And when she checked her bag, she found a small slip of paper with a phone number and a message scrawled on it. "I'm sorry for the strange behavior. I'm a sleepwalker, and I often do things that I don't remember in the morning. If I did anything to frighten you, please accept my apologies." It was a typical night in the city, and John was on his way home from work. He decided to take a shortcut through a dark alley, but as he walked, he noticed a terrible smell. It was so strong that it made him gag. As he got closer to the end of the alley, he saw a sign for a new business. The sign was handwritten and difficult to read, but it advertised a service that promised to make all your problems go away. John felt uneasy, but curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to investigate. As he entered the business, he saw a group of shady-looking characters huddled around a table. They were talking in hushed tones, and when they saw John, they all turned to stare at him. John noticed that the walls were covered in what appeared to be mold and rotting wood. Suddenly, the smell became overwhelming, and John realized that it was coming from a room in the back. He cautiously approached the door, and as he pushed it open, he was hit with the sight of something truly horrifying. The room was filled with rotting carcasses of animals, and the smell was almost unbearable. John stumbled back, but before he could react, he was grabbed by the group of shady characters. They dragged him into the room and forced him to join in their twisted business of selling rotten meat to unsuspecting customers. John was never seen again, and the business mysteriously closed down the next day. People in the area reported a lingering smell of rotten meat and strange noises coming from the alleyway. It was as if the shady business had left a permanent mark on the area, a constant reminder of the horrors that had taken place there. The hiker, Emily, had been trekking up the mountains for hours when she spotted a colorful kite high up in the sky. It was a strange sight, as there was nobody around to be flying it. As she got closer, she noticed the kite moving erratically, as if it were being controlled by an invisible force. Curiosity getting the better of her, Emily followed the kite, determined to uncover the source of its mysterious flight. After hiking for another hour, she reached the edge of a cliff overlooking a deep valley. The kite was now hovering just a few feet away from her, seemingly waiting for her to peer through the telescope that was perched on the edge of the cliff. Emily looked through the telescope and was immediately overwhelmed by a sense of dread. She could see something moving in the distance, something dark and shapeless, and it was heading straight towards her. Panicking, she tried to run back down the mountain, but the kite followed her, its string wrapping around her legs and tripping her. As she lay there, trapped and helpless, she could feel the presence of the unknown entity getting closer and closer. The kite suddenly took off, flying away into the distance as Emily was left alone, unable to move or scream. Hours later, a rescue team found Emily lying unconscious on the mountainside, with no recollection of what had happened to her. To this day, she still shudders at the thought of the mysterious flying kite and the terror that it brought with it. It was a slow night at the pizza place. The only customer was a strange man who seemed to be mumbling to himself. He sat in the corner, staring at the wall, and occasionally muttering something under his breath. The staff tried to ignore him and focus on their work, but something about him made them uneasy. Every time the doorbell rang to signal a new order, the man would flinch and grip the table tightly. But then, the ring-tone rang, and the man's behavior changed. He sat up straight and stared directly at the counter. When the staff went to grab the order, the man suddenly spoke up, his voice low and gravelly. "That's my order. Give it to me." The staff were taken aback by the sudden change in his behavior, but they handed over the pizza without argument. The man paid in cash, his fingers shaking as he counted out the bills. As the man left the store, the staff noticed a glint on his finger, a dark ring with an odd symbol etched into the metal. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. Later that night, the staff received a call from the same number that had placed the order. But instead of a voice on the other end, all they heard was the sound of heavy breathing and a faint mumbling in the background. It wasn't until the next morning that they realized the truth. The symbol on the man's ring was a sign of a cult known for performing ritual sacrifices. And in the basement of the pizza place, they found evidence that the man had been using the pizza boxes as part of his twisted rituals. From that day on, the staff never forgot the strange, creepy customer with the dark ring and the mumbling voice. It was a stormy night, and Sarah was home alone. She decided to pass the time by watching a movie on her computer. But as she settled in, she noticed something strange. Her computer screen was flickering. At first, she thought it was just a glitch, but then she heard something behind her. She turned around and saw her old doll, which she had left on her bed earlier that day, was now sitting on her desk, staring at her. Sarah tried to ignore it and focus on the movie, but the flickering got worse and the doll's eyes seemed to follow her every move. Suddenly, the power went out, leaving her in complete darkness. Panic set in, but then she heard a faint whisper coming from the doll. It said her name in a low, eerie voice. Sarah was frozen in terror, unable to move. Suddenly, the power came back on, and she saw that the doll had moved closer to her. In the light, she saw that it was covered in scratches and dirt. She tried to run, but the doll seemed to be blocking her path. Then she noticed something even more unsettling. The doll's eyes had turned red. As she stared into the doll's eyes, the flickering started again. The room was illuminated by a flickering light, making it difficult for Sarah to see anything clearly. Just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she heard the front door open. Her parents had returned home, and the doll was suddenly still and lifeless once again. Sarah never spoke of the incident again, but she could never shake the feeling that something was off about that doll. The flickering computer screen and the power outage were just the beginning of a terrifying encounter that she would never forget. It was a beautiful day, and I decided to take my family to the local zoo to enjoy the sunshine and the animals. We rented a golf cart to make it easier to navigate the vast terrain of the zoo. As we were driving along the path, we saw a group of monkeys in their enclosure. My children were thrilled to see them and wanted to stop to watch them for a while. Suddenly, one of the monkeys noticed us and seemed to take an interest in our golf car. The monkey hopped over the fence and climbed onto the roof of our golf car. At first, we thought it was cute and funny, but things quickly took a dark turn. The monkey began to claw and scratch at the roof, trying to break through to get to us. We tried to drive away, but the monkey was determined and wouldn't let go. It continued to attack the roof, eventually breaking through and leaping onto my daughter's lap. My daughter was terrified and began to scream. We tried to fend off the monkey, but it was too strong and continued to attack us. We finally managed to shake it off, but not before it had inflicted some serious injuries on us. We quickly drove to the nearest exit and rushed to the hospital for medical attention. We later found out that the monkeys had attacked a couple more visitors before they were captured. From that day on, my family and I never went back to that zoo. The memory of the monkey attack and the terror it had caused us was something we could never forget. The old graveyard was known to be haunted by the ghosts of the long dead, and few dared to venture there after dark. But one night, a group of teenagers decided to test their bravery and explore the graveyard. After midnight, they set out to find the oldest grave in the cemetery. While exploring the graveyard, they uncovered a mysterious tombstone with an inscription that read, "Here lies the old guard, who once protected this sacred ground." Suddenly, they heard a rustling sound behind them, and when they turned around, they saw an old man in a security guard uniform staring at them, holding a shovel in his hands. The old guard warned the teenagers to leave the graveyard at once, but they were too frightened to move. The old man's eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and his shovel looked like a weapon in his gnarled hands. He started walking toward them, dragging his shovel along the ground and creating an eerie sound. The teenagers' fear turned to panic, and they all ran away. They later realized that the old guard was not just an ordinary man, but a vengeful spirit who had been cursed to guard the graveyard for all eternity. The memory of the old guard haunted them for years to come, and they could never forget the bone-chilling sound of his shovel scraping against the earth as he pursued them through the darkness.